20 specialists said she was infertile, until a single father appeared and changed everything. Before we jump in, this story reached people in over 50 countries last week. Let's see how far it goes today. The leaves were falling the way they always did in October. Not all at once, not dramatically, but one at a time, each one surrendering quietly to the pull of something it couldn't resist. David Mercer watched them from the path, one hand wrapped around the handle of the stroller he no longer needed, because Alyssa had outgrown it 2 years ago, but he kept it anyway for her stuffed rabbit. Mr. Buttons, who needed a seat of his own on long walks. That was the kind of father David was. The kind who noticed what mattered to his daughter, even when it was a worn-out rabbit with one eye missing and a button nose that had been sewn back on 3 times. "Daddy," Alyssa said, pulling at the hem of his jacket. "Can we feed the ducks?" "We don't have bread, baby. We have crackers." He looked down at her. 6 years old, brown pigtails, a gap where her front tooth used to be, and eyes that looked at the world like it owed her nothing and still expected everything from it. He reached into his jacket pocket and found the sleeve of crackers he always kept there. Because Alyssa asked about ducks at least once every visit to Riverside Park, and David Mercer was the kind of man who prepared. "We have crackers," he agreed. She took his hand, and they walked toward the pond together. Riverside Park in October was not the kind of place where rich people came to be seen. In summer, the pavilion filled with fundraisers and sponsored events, and the north end of the park was landscaped with the kind of precision that required a budget David earned in a month just to maintain for a weekend. But in October, when the caterers packed up and the photographers stopped coming, the park returned to the people who had always loved it. The dog walkers, the old men on chessboards, the parents with strollers, and the ones who sat alone on the green iron benches near the water and looked at nothing in particular. She was sitting on one of those benches. David noticed her the way a man notices something that doesn't quite fit. Not because it's wrong, but because it's too still. Everyone else in the park was moving. The joggers, the children, the couple arguing quietly near the fountain. But this woman sat like she had been placed there, like a piece of furniture someone forgot to take inside before the cold came. She was young, younger than he expected from the stillness. 30, maybe 32. Dark coat, dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that costs more than David made in a week. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she was staring at the water with the particular blankness of someone who had stopped waiting for something a long time ago. Alyssa saw her too. David felt his daughter's hand slow down before she stopped entirely, the way children do when something catches them. Not with alarm, but with pure, uncomplicated curiosity. "Daddy," Alyssa whispered, not quietly enough. "Why is that lady sad?" "Alyssa," but she was already walking toward the bench. He followed because that was what fathers did. You didn't let your 6-year-old walk up to strangers alone in a park, no matter how quiet the park was or how still the stranger seemed. He kept his pace casual and his voice ready, prepared to redirect, apologize, steer his daughter back to the ducks and the crackers and the ordinary business of Tuesday afternoon. He didn't get the chance. Alyssa stopped 2 feet from the bench, tilted her head the way she always did when she was about to ask something she had already decided needed asking, and said with complete sincerity, "What's your name?" The woman looked up, and something happened in her face that David couldn't name exactly. Not surprise, not annoyance, not the polite blankness that adults usually offered to strange children who spoke to them without warning. It was something older than any of those. Something that moved behind her eyes like a light being turned on in a room that had been dark for a very long time. "Penelope," she said. Her voice was quieter than David expected. "I'm Alyssa," his daughter announced. "That's my daddy, his name is David. We're feeding the ducks, but we only have crackers, not bread, because Daddy says bread isn't good for ducks even though they seem to like it." She paused for breath. "Do you want to come?" The woman, Penelope, looked from Alyssa to David. He offered what he hoped was a reassuring expression and a small lift of one hand, the universal gesture of a parent who is apologizing and also privately proud at the same time. "I'm sorry," he said. "She talks to everyone." "Don't apologize," Penelope said. She was still looking at Alyssa. She's lovely. Thank you." He reached down and took Alyssa's hand. come on, sweetheart, leave the lady in peace. But I invited her to see the ducks. I heard you invite her. She didn't say no. He looked at Penelope. She was watching his daughter with an expression he'd seen before, in a specific kind of face, the face of someone encountering something they wanted so badly they had trained themselves not to want it anymore. He recognized that face because he'd worn it once himself, standing outside a hospital room listening to a doctor explain what was and wasn't possible. "You're welcome to join us," he said, and meant it. "She'll be disappointed for approximately 45 seconds if you say no, and then she'll find something else to care about." Penelope almost smiled. 45 seconds? I've timed it. She stood up from the bench. She was taller than he'd expected, and there was something in the way she moved. Careful, precise, the way people move when they've spent a long time not quite trusting the ground beneath them. They walked to the pond together. He didn't know, yet, who she was. The name Penelope Voss meant nothing to him in the context of a woman in a dark coat feeding crackers to ungrateful ducks, with a 6-year-old who narrated everything like a documentary filmmaker. He knew the name from headlines vaguely, the kind of headlines he absorbed by proximity while waiting in line at the pharmacy, or overhearing the television in the break room at work. Penelope Voss, 30 years old, sole heir to the Voss Group, a real estate and infrastructure empire that had shaped the skyline of this city for 3 generations. He knew the name the way working men know the names of things that exist in a different gravity, distantly without resentment, the way you know the name of a mountain you'll never climb. But standing at the edge of the pond while Alyssa threw crackers and narrated the ducks' reactions with the authority of a wildlife biologist, David Mercer was not thinking about any of that. He was thinking about how long it had been since he'd stood next to another adult in this park. He was thinking about the crackers running low. He was thinking about whether Alyssa's jacket was warm enough and whether he'd remembered to sign her field trip form for Friday. He was thinking, as he always was, about everything except himself. "How old is she?" Penelope asked. 6. 7 in March. "She's not afraid of anything, is she?" "Not of people," David said. "Heights a little. Loud motorcycles, but people, no. She just walks up and starts talking." He paused. Her mother was like that. He didn't know why he said it. He almost never said it. Penelope was quiet for a moment. "Was?" She passed. 3 years ago. Another pause. "I'm sorry. Thank you." He said it the way he always said it, honestly, without the deflection some people expected, and without the weight that some people wanted. He had learned to carry loss like a stone in his pocket, always there, always felt, but not in the way, not slowing him down on the path. They watched Alyssa argue with a particularly stubborn duck about who deserved the last cracker. "She looks like you," Penelope said. "Everyone says she has her mother's eyes." "Maybe, but she has your way of standing." He glanced at her, not sure what to make of that. She was looking at Alyssa with the same expression she'd worn on the bench, that careful, controlled hunger. But now there was something else in it. Something that might, with enough patience and enough October light, become something like peace. That was when the black car pulled up along the park road. It was a car built for authority. Not the subtle authority of old money, but the loud, declarative authority of new money that had learned to imitate old money and hadn't quite gotten it right. Long, dark, running on a silence that cost 6 figures. It stopped on the curved road that ran along the east side of the park, and 2 people got out. The first was a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered in a tailored suit that didn't quite fit across the chest, hair slicked back with the kind of confidence that came from being permanently right in his own mind. He carried a tablet and a phone, both in one hand, and he was already talking before his feet hit the ground. The second was a woman in her late 30s, sharp features, clipboard, the practiced efficiency of someone who had made herself indispensable and wanted everyone to know it at all times. David watched them scan the park with the focused energy of people looking for something they owned. They found Penelope. The man, David would learn his name was Harlan Voss, her cousin and the operating director of the Voss Group's residential division, walked across the grass with the stride of someone who had never been told the word no, and had come to believe this was a universal condition rather than a personal privilege. "Penelope." Not a greeting. An accounting. "You missed the call with Whitmore's people." I know. You knew? I decided I'd rather sit in the park. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the duck that was still negotiating with Alyssa. The leaves kept falling. The water kept moving. The alarm went off at 5:15 in the morning. The same as every morning, and David was already awake. He had been awake since 4:40, which was also typical. There was a period, after Sarah died, when the early mornings were the worst of it. The hour between first light and the alarm when the bed was still warm on one side, and the silence in the apartment had a specific quality. A presence like something that had moved in after she left and hadn't been asked. He used to lie there and think about her. Not the end. He'd made a deliberate practice of not thinking about the end. But the beginning. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she finished telling them. The way she kept her keys in her coat pocket instead of her bag, and lost them constantly, and blamed the pocket. Never herself. He didn't do that anymore. Or he did it less. Or he did it differently. Not with the weight of loss, but with something that had settled over 3 years into a kind of gratitude, as if her memory was a furnace, and he had finally learned to stand at the right distance from it, close enough to be warm, far enough not to burn. He got up at 5:15, turned the alarm off before it could ring a second time. Alyssa slept lightly and needed all the sleep she could get because kindergarten had her up by 7, and she fought it every morning like it was a personal insult, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. The apartment was small. 340 square feet if you counted the bathroom, which David always did because counting the bathroom made it larger. One bedroom, where Alyssa slept in the bed, and David slept on the fold-out when the couch got old, or on the couch itself when she had nightmares and he needed to be closer to the door. A kitchen that was technically a kitchen because it contained a stove and a refrigerator, though they occupied the same strip of wall that separated the living space from the front door. A window above the sink that faced east and caught the light in the mornings in a way that made the whole apartment feel different from the way it looked on paper. He had made it work. That was the only way he thought about it, not with pride because there was nothing particularly prideful about surviving the minimum, but with the quiet competence of a man who had learned to solve problems with what was available. The coffee brewed. He sat at the small table by the east window and watched the sky turn from gray to pale orange to the particular blue of early October mornings. And he thought about the woman in the park. He had thought about her the previous evening too while making Alyssa's dinner and checking her reading folder, and giving Mr. Buttons a formal inspection after Alyssa insisted the rabbit had a cold. He'd thought about the expression on her face when she heard the word passed. He'd thought about the way she'd looked at his daughter, not with the vague, detached interest of someone who found children generically appealing, but with something specific, something personal, the kind of look that knows what it's looking at and aches for it. He didn't know her story. He knew her name, Penelope Voss, and he'd done what any man with an internet connection and a vague sense of curiosity would do at 9:30 at night after putting his daughter to bed. He'd looked her up, not extensively, not with the focused attention of someone building a case, just the first page of results, the way you might read the cover of a magazine you'd never buy. What he found was the usual construction of a public person, the business headline, the charity gala photograph, the profile piece in a regional finance magazine, the name attached to various acquisitions and capital campaigns that moved money around the city's skyline in ways that were important to people who tracked those things. He found one personal piece, 3 years old in a lifestyle supplement, brief, carefully controlled, the kind of interview where the subject answers questions without saying anything. She talked about the company's expansion, the legacy of the Voss name, her philosophy of investment. She did not talk about herself in any way that opened a door. He'd closed the laptop and gone to check on Alyssa, and that had been that. Now in the morning light with the coffee and the quiet, he thought about her differently, not as a headline or a legacy, as a woman on a bench in October who looked like she had forgotten how to want something. He knew that look. He had worn it himself, for about a year after Sarah. The careful blankness. The training yourself out of hope because hope cost too much and paid too little. He understood it. He did not pity it. There was a difference. At 6:45, he woke Alyssa with the routine they had built together. A knock on the door, 3 seconds, then the opening. "Good morning, sunshine." She said, 5 more minutes every single day, regardless of how awake she already was. And he said 0 more minutes every single day, regardless of how much time they actually had. And she got up and they had breakfast. And she narrated the morning the way she narrated everything. And by 7:30 they were outside, walking the 4 blocks to Maple Grove Elementary in the leaf-covered air of early fall. He dropped her at the gate where Mrs. Caldwell, the morning aide, was stationed with her fluorescent vest and her coffee, and her institutional warmth. "Morning, Mr. Mercer." "Morning, Mrs. Caldwell." "Have a good one." "You too." This was the entire conversation. This was its own kind of richness. The small, clean language of people who showed up on time and meant what they said. And he walked back toward the park maintenance depot with his hands in his pockets and the October air in his lungs. And for a while, not long, but for a while, he felt like a man who had things in order. He worked the morning shift at the City Park Service. Had worked it for 6 years, since Alyssa was born, and he'd made the decision to be present over being ambitious. The work was not glamorous. It was raking and hauling and mulching and repairing benches and retrieving the things people left behind. Umbrellas, water bottles, occasionally wallets. Once a wedding ring that he turned into the city office and thought about for a week afterward. But the work was outdoors, and it was physical, and there was a clarity to it that he had come to depend on. You knew when you were done, you could see the results. The path was clear or it wasn't. The bed was mulched or it wasn't. In the years since Sarah, in the years of grief and single fatherhood and the constant low-grade pressure of making the money last until the next paycheck, the work's simplicity had been a kind of medicine. His supervisor was a man named Pete Giordano, 58, 3 years from retirement, who had the look of a man who had made peace with his choices and would advise the same for everyone else. Pete left David alone except for the morning briefing and the afternoon checkout, which suited them both perfectly. The morning briefing that day was unusual. "Got word from facilities," Pete said, not looking up from his clipboard. "The east section of Riverside and the section with the pond area is being considered for renovation. Private funding." David looked up from the equipment rack. "Renovation? New pavilion or something. Developer group. They're sending someone to walk the section this week, do an assessment." Pete finally looked up. "Usual thing. Be professional, answer questions if asked, don't make promises." "Who's the developer group?" Pete consulted the clipboard. "Voss Group." David said nothing. "Something?" Pete asked. "No," David said. "Nothing." He thought about it all morning, not with anxiety, but with the strange, specific alertness of a man who has noticed that the world has taken an interest in coincidence. He thought about it while raking the leaf cover from the path near the east fence, and while filling the gap in the bench slats near the fountain, and while hauling the mulch cart up the hill behind the maintenance shed. At noon, eating a sandwich on the tailgate of the work truck, he got a text from a number he didn't recognize. It said, "This is Penelope Voss. Your daughter left Mr. Buttons on the bench yesterday. I have him. I hope she's not too worried." He stared at the message for a long time. Then he remembered. They'd rushed off the bench quickly when Harlan arrived, and Alyssa had put Mr. Buttons down to feed the ducks, and in the confusion, his daughter's wounded dignity, his own careful departure, the effort of walking away straight, neither of them had thought about the rabbit. He texted back, "She's worried. She told me he went on an adventure. Thank you for finding him." A minute passed. Then, "He seems like a seasoned traveler, one-eyed and all." "3 surgeries," David replied. "He's been through things." Another pause, longer. Then, "So have most good ones." He read that last message twice, set his phone down, finished his sandwich, looked out at the park through the windshield of the city truck. His park, the east section, the section someone was going to renovate, and thought about what it meant to have been through things, and still be standing, and whether the standing itself was enough or whether it was just the beginning of something else. He didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure he needed one yet. What he knew was simpler. He needed to get Mr. Buttons back. Alyssa would start asking about the rabbit's adventure in approximately 4 hours, and by bedtime she'd need the full story with a satisfying conclusion. He texted, "I get off work at 4, if it's not too much trouble." The reply came fast, faster than he expected. Riverside Park, same bench, I'll be there. He went back to work. Something in the afternoon had quietly, irreversibly changed. The second meeting went differently from the first. There was no cousin, no black car, no woman with a clipboard measuring the distance between Penelope Voss and the ordinary world, as if it were a risk to be managed. There was only the bench and the late afternoon light coming low through the oaks, and the pond going copper in the October sun, and Penelope sitting in the same spot she had occupied the day before, as if she had simply remained there through the night, patient as stone. Mr. Buttons was on the bench beside her, propped against the armrest with the careful dignity of a stuffed animal that understood its own importance. David saw the rabbit before he saw her. He was still 30 yards away when Alyssa spotted it. Mr. Buttons's one remaining eye caught the light in a way that only happened when a 6-year-old was specifically looking, and she made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a declaration of victory, and pulled David's arm with a force that defied her body weight. Mr. Buttons. Inside voice. We're outside. He let her run. She crossed the grass in the uneven full commitment sprint of a child who has not yet learned to protect herself from stumbling, which meant she committed completely and trusted her feet to handle the details. She reached the bench and gathered the rabbit against her chest with both arms, and stood there for a moment with her eyes closed, just holding it, the way people hold things they were afraid they'd lost. Penelope watched her with an expression David had started to think of as her particular expression, the one that lived between something very close to joy and something very close to grief, occupying the territory between them with a quiet that felt earned. Thank you, David said, arriving, for keeping him safe. He was good company, Penelope said. Her voice was different from the day before, easier somehow, less sealed. We talked. About what? She looked at Mr. Buttons, who was now being carried in a formal procession around the bench by Alyssa, who was narrating his return to service in authoritative tones. About being one-eyed and still seeing clearly. David sat down on the bench. He had not been invited to, but Penelope did not seem to require that kind of architecture. The formal invitation, the established permission. The bench simply had 2 people on it now instead of 1, and the afternoon accommodated the change without comment. They watched Alyssa march. She's amazing, Penelope said, not casually, with weight. She is, David said. No deflection, no false modesty. A man who knew what he had. Does she know how lucky she is? She's 6. She knows I make good pancakes, and that's about the ceiling of what she considers her blessings. Penelope almost smiled again. It was becoming a pattern. The almost smile, the thing that got most of the way to its destination and then stopped, as if finishing it required something she hadn't fully located yet. I looked you up, she said. He turned to look at her. She was watching the pond. I'm not sure what you would have found, he said. Not much, that's part of what I found. She paused. City Parks employee. Before that, the record goes quiet, a period of nothing. Then you're here, with a daughter, working in the park. She finally looked at him. Most people have more noise than that. I'm a quiet person, or a private one. Is there a difference? One is temperament, she said. The other is choice. He looked at her for a moment. This woman who had spent 20 years learning to protect herself from wanting things, who sat in parks in October like she was waiting for something she'd given up believing in, who had looked his daughter in the face and felt something move in the carefully sealed room of herself. And he made a choice of his own. Before Alyssa, he said. Before the Park Service. I worked in security consulting, private sector, international work. He paused. It was not the kind of work you talk about at dinner parties. What kind was it? The kind where the people who needed you had already exhausted every other option. High-risk extractions, threat assessment in unstable environments, client protection in places where local law enforcement was either absent or part of the problem. He said it the way he always said things, simply without performance, the way a man describes a fact rather than a story. I was good at it. For 11 years I was very good at it. Penelope was quiet for a moment. What happened? Sarah got sick. He said it without looking away from the pond. The work took me out of the country 4 months out of 12, sometimes more. When she was diagnosed, when we knew what we were looking at, I came home. Permanently. A beat. I made a choice. You gave it up. I traded it. There's a difference. She considered that. And you don't miss it? He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about all things that deserved honesty. Some days I walk into a room and I notice every exit before I notice the furniture. And I don't know if that's something I trained or something I became. Some days Alyssa says something that sounds like something Sarah would have said, and I feel the ground shift. Some days, he stopped, restarted more carefully. Some days the park is exactly the right size for a man who used to live at a much larger scale. And that's enough to build on. Penelope looked at him. You don't seem like a man who has given up. I haven't, he said. I've redirected. Something shifted in her face. The almost smile completed itself briefly before returning to its usual halfway point. But for a second it was full. And it changed her entirely. Not into someone happier, but into someone more visible. Someone who was actually there. I have a meeting tomorrow, she said. In this park. A site assessment. She paused. Harlan is leading it. I know, David said. I work this section. She looked at him sharply. Then she understood. The Park Service. City Parks East Division have been for 6 years. The pause that followed was long enough that Alyssa looped around the bench twice and stopped in front of them to report, formally, that Mr. Buttons had been debriefed and his intelligence was satisfactory. Good to know, David told her. He says he liked Penelope's coat, Alyssa added. He says it was very soft. The rabbit has good taste, Penelope said. Alyssa considered this gravely, then nodded and resumed her patrol. Harlan will see you, Penelope said quietly. I know. He'll make it uncomfortable. He was already uncomfortable. David looked at her. I've worked harder places than this park, around harder people than your cousin. It doesn't change what I do or how I do it. Penelope was quiet for a long moment. Then, I owe you an apology. For yesterday. He had no right. You don't owe me anything, David said, not sharply, firmly. You didn't make him who he is. You can't apologize for a person. You can only apologize for yourself. He paused. And you were nothing but kind. She looked at him like the statement surprised her. Like kindness was something she had learned to minimize, to place at the small end of the scale, to discount as insufficient. I wasn't kind, she said. I was rude to you and my daughter, Alyssa called from across the bench. She's not wrong, David said. He was rude to you. I didn't stop it fast enough. You stopped it. Not soon enough. He turned to look at her fully. Penelope, I'm a 36-year-old man who has carried more than yesterday in my hands and not dropped any of it. I don't need protecting. I appreciate the instinct, but I don't need it. He held her gaze. What I do appreciate is sitting on this bench with someone who's actually paying attention. That's rarer than you might think. She looked at him for a long time. Long enough for Alyssa to complete another circuit and for a family of ducks to cross the far edge of the pond in single file. Unhurried, as if they owned the water and were simply allowing the humans to observe it at no charge. I've been trying to remember, Penelope said finally, how to want something. It was the most honest thing she had said to him. He could feel the weight of it. Not just the words, but the effort behind them. The decision to say it out loud to someone she had met yesterday in a park, over crackers and a rabbit with one eye. What gets in the way? He asked. She took a breath, looked at the water. I spent 2 years going to specialists, 20 of them, in 4 different countries, asking them the same question in different cities with different equipment and different degrees on the wall. She paused. They all gave me the same answer. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was something the work had trained in him. The understanding that silence, held carefully, created the space for people to say what they needed to say. They told me I couldn't have children, she said. Couldn't carry a pregnancy. The mechanism, the specific combination of things that are wrong, is considered permanent. Not treatable. Not fixable. Another pause. 20 people with the best equipment in the world looked at my body and told me what it was incapable of. And you believed them, David said. Not as an accusation. As an observation. Wouldn't you? He considered it. I believe in data, he said. I also believe that data tells you what has happened, not always what can happen. There's a space in between. She looked at him. That's not a scientific position. No, he agreed. It's a human one. She shook her head slowly. I watched your daughter feed ducks with crackers for 20 minutes yesterday. She talked to me like I was the most natural thing in the world for a stranger to talk to, and I thought... She stopped. What did you think? Not today. The site assessment was scheduled for 9 in the morning on a Thursday, and David arrived at the east section at 7:45, which was his habit regardless of whether anyone was watching. He had learned something in 11 years of work that required precision under pressure. The man who arrives early owns the ground, not in the way the man with the clipboard owns it, not with paper and authority and the language of acquisition, but in the quieter, more permanent way of someone who has been there before the others arrive and will be there after they leave. The early man knows where the soft spots are in the path. He knows which bench wobbles on its east leg and which drain runs slow after rain. He knows the light at 7:45, the way it comes sideways through the oaks and makes everything look like the beginning of something. David knew this park the way he knew his daughter's breathing in the dark. Not by thinking about it, but by being present for it, consistently, over time, until the knowing became part of him. He raked the leaf cover from the main path first, then checked the water inlet near the pond's north edge, which had been running a 1/4 inch high since Tuesday's rain. Then worked his way toward the pavilion site, the open stretch of flat ground east of the pond where the city's original plans had called for a bandstand that was never built. Where children flew kites in spring and where David had found, over 6 years, 3 wallets, 1 engagement ring, 2 car keys, and a journal written entirely in a language he didn't recognize. The Voss Group's people arrived at 9:02. There were 4 of them. Harlan Voss in front, moving the way he always moved, as if the ground had been placed there specifically for his feet. Behind him, the woman with the clipboard from the park 2 days ago, whose name David would learn was Sylvia, and who had the practiced efficiency of someone who had made herself so useful that she had stopped being a person and become a function. Behind them, 2 men in different versions of the same expensive casualness, open collars, leather shoes that hadn't met actual earth before today, the faint air of architecture school and venture capital. Harlan saw David immediately. Something moved across his face. Recognition, calibration, the rapid internal accounting of a man who has filed something away and is now retrieving it. He didn't acknowledge it outwardly. He turned to Sylvia and said something David couldn't hear, and Sylvia made a note on her clipboard, and the group moved toward the pavilion site with the authority of people who have already decided what they're going to find. David kept raking. He raked within 30 feet of them. His job required it. The leaf cover on this section needed clearing, and his job was to clear it, and he was not going to do his job less well because there were people nearby who preferred not to see him. He moved steadily, the rake finding the leaves with the easy rhythm of a man who has done this particular motion enough times that it requires no thought, which freed his mind to observe. Harlan was describing something with his hands, a footprint, a shape, the pavilion's proposed layout, David gathered, or something like it. The 2 architects were nodding. Sylvia was writing. David watched from the periphery the way he had learned to watch things, without staring, without signaling that he was watching, from the soft edge of his vision where the information came in without the subject knowing it was being collected. At 9:20, Harlan turned and looked directly at him. You. Not a name. Not a question. A summons. David stopped raking. He waited. This is city property, correct? Under current Park Service maintenance? Correct, David said. And you're the maintenance worker assigned to this section. I am. Harlan looked at him for a moment with the particular attention of a man trying to locate something he can't quite find. You were in the park Tuesday. With the child? Yes. And you're the assigned maintenance worker for this section? Yes. Harlan seemed to sit with this information, turning it over. There was something he wanted to say. David could see it in the set of his jaw, the careful control of a man accustomed to saying what he wanted and recalibrating only when the social cost became visible. He was calculating the social cost right now. The Voss group is in preliminary discussions with the city regarding the section's redevelopment, Harlan said finally. His tone had shifted, not warmer, but more formal, which in his vocabulary was the same as more dangerous. We'll need access to survey the drainage system in the eastern boundary. That will mean restricted foot traffic in this zone starting next week. I'll need that in writing from the park's director, David said. Harlan blinked. It was a small blink, barely visible, but David had learned to read the small things. Excuse me? Access restrictions to city park sections require written authorization from the Parks Department director. If your group wants to restrict foot traffic, you'll need to go through Director Malone's office. He paused. I can give you the contact information if you need it. One of the architects looked at the ground. Sylvia made a very careful note on her clipboard. The other architect seemed to be studying the pond with new intensity. Harlan looked at David for a long, measured moment. You're very familiar with municipal procedure, he said. The tone was meant to be dismissive. It didn't land that way. 6 years in city parks will do that, David said. He picked up his rake and went back to work. He was not trying to win anything. He understood that with a clarity that had come from years of operating in environments where winning and losing were measured in consequences far heavier than a park renovation discussion. He was simply doing his job with the standard of care his job required. And that standard included knowing the rules well enough to apply them when someone tried to move around them. That was not defiance, that was competence. But there was something else in it too. Something he wouldn't have examined out loud, but that lived in him with the steadiness of a thing long decided. When Harlan Voss looked at David Mercer and saw a man with a rake and a work order and a daughter and no resume worth reading, he was looking at a partial truth. And partial truths had a way of correcting themselves given time. David knew that from experience. The site visit lasted another 40 minutes. David worked the section throughout, never more than 100 feet from the group, never less than professional in every motion. At 10:15, the group walked back toward the car. Harlan did not look at him again. Sylvia did, though. As she passed, she glanced at him once, not with hostility, not with the measuring look Harlan used, with something closer to curiosity, as if she had filed something away and was not sure what folder it belonged in. David raked the last of the leaves from the pavilion site path and loaded them into the cart. At noon, there was another text from Penelope. It said, I heard there was a site visit this morning. He replied, There was. A pause. Then, How did it go? He thought about this for a moment. Then, he asked me about drainage authorization. I told him the process. Another pause. Longer. Then, he came back to the office and told me the groundskeeper had been unnecessarily obstructive. David read this. Then, Did you tell him I wasn't the groundskeeper? The reply came quickly. I told him you were a city employee exercising appropriate professional procedure. Then, after a beat, he didn't like that either. David put the phone away and finished loading the cart. The afternoon had come on fully now, the October sun low and direct. The park in that particular afternoon light that made ordinary things look like they were being remembered rather than seen. He thought about Penelope's message. Not the content of it, the content was simple enough, but the fact of it, the ease of it, the way she had texted him, the way a person texts someone they have established a rhythm with, a shorthand, a baseline trust. He was not certain when that had happened. It might have happened on a bench over crackers and ducks. It might have happened when a one-eyed rabbit was returned with a message about seeing clearly. He thought about the way she had said, I've been trying to remember how to want something. He thought about what it would mean to want something he had not let himself want in 3 years. He thought about Alyssa, who had asked about Penelope at breakfast that morning, casually between bites of toast, the way children ask about things that have already been decided in their internal world. Is Penelope coming to the park again? I don't know, he had said. Why? She has a nice coat, Alyssa said, with the authority of a 6-year-old who considers this definitive character evidence. He had not told Alyssa that he and Penelope had been texting. There was nothing to tell, technically. And yet there was something being built quietly at the edges of his life, the way things were built in this park. Not all at once, not dramatically, but stone by stone, season by season, in the patient language of things that intend to last. He drove the cart back to the maintenance depot. He thought about her hands on the bench, the careful way she sat, the thing behind her eyes that was not dead, only waiting. He thought about the scar on his wrist. There were things he had not told her, things that existed in the quiet period in his record, the years that showed up as silence when you searched his name, 11 years of work in places with no civilian names, for people with no other options, with no trace in any public record. The call came on a Saturday morning at 8:17 from a number with a Washington, D.C. area code. David was making pancakes when his phone rang. He looked at the number for 2 full seconds before answering, during which Alyssa climbed onto the counter stool and watched him with the patient attention of a child who has learned that her father's face sometimes becomes very still, and that when it does, the right thing to do is wait. "Mercer," he said. There was a pause on the line, the specific pause of someone who is confirming they have reached the right person. Then a voice, male, the careful neutrality of a man trained to give nothing away in the first sentence. "David?" "It's Marcus Webb." David set the spatula down on the counter. Marcus Webb was 53 years old, gray-haired in a way that had happened early and suited him, operating director of a private security and intelligence consulting firm whose name appeared on no website and whose clients appeared on no public record. He had been David's supervisor for 7 of David's 11 years in that work. He had been, in the specific and irreplaceable way of men who trust each other in dangerous places, the closest thing David had to a brother in those years. They had not spoken in 3 years. Not since the week David came home for the last time. "Marcus," David said. "I'll be brief," Marcus said. "I'm in the city. I have something I need to talk to you about in person, not on the phone. A beat. It involves your name coming up somewhere it shouldn't." David looked at Alyssa, who was still watching him with that patient, ancient patience of hers. "I can do this afternoon," David said. 2 o'clock. "Good. The coffee place on Meridian and 7th. I'll be there." The call ended. David stood at the counter for a moment. Then he flipped the pancakes because the pancakes still needed flipping, and because the presence of a complication did not excuse the absence of breakfast. "Who was that?" Alyssa asked. "An old friend," David said. "He wants to have coffee." "Can I come?" "No, sweetheart. I'm going to take you to Grandma Joyce's and have coffee with my friend, and then I'll come get you." "Does he like ducks?" "I have no idea. You should ask him." He took Alyssa to his mother-in-law's house at noon. Joyce, 71, quick and warm and permanently useful, who had made clear in the 3 years since Sarah died that her relationship with David and Alyssa was not contingent on anything except love, which was the only kind of relationship David had any use for. He drove to Meridian and 7th, parked, and walked into the coffee shop at 158. Marcus was already there. He looked the same, grayer possibly, more at the temples than David remembered, but with the same stillness, the same quality of occupying a room without advertising himself. He was drinking black coffee and reading nothing, which was always how Marcus waited. Men who had done this work did not fill the waiting with distraction. They shook hands. They ordered. They sat. "Your name came up," Marcus said without preamble, "in connection with a surveillance inquiry initiated by a private entity, not government, private. Corporate intelligence contractor, mid-tier, the kind that does background work for high-net-worth individuals and institutional clients." David was quiet. "The inquiry was flagged through a contact of mine who runs information security for one of our former clients. He recognized your name in the sweep and reached out. The inquiry was broad: employment history, associates, current activities." Marcus looked at him steadily. "It was ordered 6 days ago." 6 days ago, David said. He thought about what had happened 6 days ago. Tuesday, the park, the black car, the man in the suit who had looked at him and reached a conclusion. "Harlan Voss," David said. Marcus didn't react visibly, which was itself a reaction. "You know him?" "I've met him twice." David leaned back in his chair. "He's the operations director for the Voss Group. Real estate. His cousin is—" He stopped. "Penelope Voss," Marcus said. David looked at him. "You've met her," Marcus said. It wasn't a question. The inquiry pulled your current environment. Riverside Park is under her family's development consideration. You appeared in her proximity twice in 6 days. He paused. Harlan Voss appears to be building a file. For what purpose? Unknown. At this stage. Could be standard due diligence on someone close to an asset he manages. Could be something more specific. Marcus set down his coffee. There's more. David waited. Your file, the real one, the full one, is flagged at a level that civilian contractors don't have clean access to. Whoever Harlan hired pulled a partial record. They got the public-facing version. City employee, prior gap in employment history, nothing actionable. Marcus paused. They didn't get what's underneath the gap. But you're telling me someone tried. I'm telling you someone tried, and I'm telling you that the classified portions of your service record, the contracts, the operations, the assets protected, those are sealed at a level that would require a federal inquiry to access legitimately. He looked at David carefully, which means Harlan Voss currently has an incomplete picture. And when it becomes complete? That depends on how far he's willing to push, and on what he's actually looking for. David was quiet for a moment. The coffee shop moved around them. The ordinary Saturday morning machinery of other people's lives, orders placed, conversations had, the soft background noise of a world that did not know it, shared a room with two men discussing the architecture of danger. The work I did, David said, any of it, if it surfaced in the wrong context, there are people whose names are attached to that work who would prefer it remain classified, Marcus said simply, including 3 current members of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and a sitting cabinet secretary. He let that settle. None of them are your enemies, David, but none of them can publicly acknowledge your existence in that context, which means that if this surfaces in a way that creates visibility, you're on your own until the right people have time to manage it quietly. And the child? David asked. His voice was different when he asked it. Not harder, but more focused, the way a lens is focused. No inquiry has touched her, Marcus said immediately, or your current domestic situation. This is about you. David breathed out, once, slowly. What do you need from me? Nothing, for now. I wanted you to have the information. And I wanted to tell you something else. Marcus looked at him with the directness of a man who had said difficult things, in difficult circumstances, and had long since stopped dressing them up. The work you did, David, the people you extracted, the situations you resolved, you did more than most people will ever know, in more places than the record will ever show. You chose to walk away from it with your integrity intact, and your reasons your own. He paused. Whatever this man is building a file for, whatever he thinks he knows about you, it isn't the truth of you, and the truth has a way of being more durable than the file. David sat with that. I appreciate you coming, he said. I owed you several of these. This was one. Marcus picked up his coffee. How's the girl? 6. Incredible. She argues with ducks. She sounds like her father. They sat for another 20 minutes. They talked about other things. Not the work, not the file, but the particular inventory of 2 men catching up after years. Families, cities, the specific small dignities and indignities of middle age. It was comfortable in the way that things are comfortable when they have been tested by something serious and survived. David drove back to Joyce's house. He sat in the car for 5 minutes before going in. He thought about Penelope. He thought about a man who would commission a surveillance inquiry on a city park worker because that worker had spoken correctly to him about municipal procedure. He thought about the specific architecture of that kind of insecurity. The wealthy man who could not tolerate the existence of a person who did not adjust themselves to his presence, who needed the world to confirm his reading of it at every point. He thought about the way Penelope had said, I've been trying to remember how to want something. He thought about what it must be like to live in proximity to that kind of power. Not her power, which was real and earned and hers, but his power. The borrowed operational power of a man who ran things without owning them and needed that to mean more than it did. He thought about Alyssa, asking if Penelope liked ducks. He thought about whether what was happening between him and Penelope, whatever it was, whatever name it was moving toward, was going to bring something difficult into both their lives. He already knew the answer. He had known it since Tuesday on the bench, watching her face change when Alyssa said her name. Some things were worth the difficult. He went inside to get his daughter. That evening, after dinner, and after Alyssa was asleep, he texted Penelope. "There's something I should tell you." Not a text conversation. "Can we meet?" The reply came in 4 minutes. "The park, tomorrow, same bench, 10 o'clock. He set the phone down. He looked at the scar on his wrist for a long moment. The long, pale ridge that didn't come from a garden bed. The mark of a cable that had held weight it wasn't designed to hold. On a rooftop in Karachi, in the dark, for 47 seconds, while the man attached to it was pulled to safety. The scar was part of him. So was the park, the apartment, the child. Tomorrow he would show all of it to someone who asked. The bench was empty when David arrived at 9:52. He sat down. The park held its October light with the same patient generosity it always did. The oaks going from green to amber along the east fence, the pond flat and silver in the morning, the path clear and raked, which meant someone on the early shift had done good work. He looked at his hands. The right one. The inside of the wrist. The scar. He had spent 11 years being the kind of person who walked into rooms and knew exactly what was true about everyone in them, and kept it behind his eyes where it was useful and not where it was visible. He had spent 3 years being a father, which required the opposite skill. The full openness of a person who could not afford to be unreachable, because his daughter needed him present, not positioned. He had made peace with the distance between those two men. Now he was going to let someone else see both of them at once. Penelope arrived at 10:03. She walked the way she always walked, the careful precision of someone who had learned to move through the world without taking up too much of it. She was wearing the dark coat again, the one Alyssa had approved of, and she was carrying 2 cups of coffee, one of which she held out to him as she sat without preface or ceremony. He took it. "You wanted to tell me something," she said. "Yes." She waited. She was good at waiting, he had noticed, a skill that surprised him given the efficiency of her public world. But in the park, on the bench, she had this quality of stillness, as if this was the one place she allowed herself to not be in a hurry. He started simply, because he had learned that the simple start was almost always the right one. "My employment record has a gap in it," he said. 11 years of work that doesn't appear on any professional resume or public filing. If you searched my name in the usual ways, you'd find the Park Service, and before that a period of nothing, and before that a couple of years of ordinary work after college. "I noticed the gap," she said. "I know. You told me." She was watching him, not pressing, letting it come at his pace. "For 11 years. Starting when I was 22, I worked in private security and intelligence consulting. Not corporate security, not the kind that means standing outside a building in a suit. The other kind. High risk, international, client extraction from environments where the clients had no other means of getting out." He paused. "The work was real. The people I helped were real. The danger was real." Another pause. "And the reason it doesn't appear in my record is that the contracts were classified, the clients were protected by confidentiality agreements at a federal level, and several of the operations were conducted in coordination with government agencies that cannot publicly acknowledge what they do." Penelope was quiet. He watched her face, not for the reaction he feared, which would have been fear itself or withdrawal, or the recalibration of someone who had decided he was something other than what she'd thought. He watched for the truth of what she felt, which was harder to see and more important. She was still, as thinking, the real kind of thinking. "The scar," she said. He looked down at his wrist. "Karachi. A client on a rooftop, a cable that wasn't rated for the load." He said it without drama because it had no drama left in it after enough years. "The client made it. So did I." She breathed in slowly. "Why are you telling me now? What changed?" "I was told on Saturday that someone commissioned a background inquiry on me 6 days ago. The inquiry was ordered by Harlan." He watched her face. "He got a partial record. The classified portions are sealed. He doesn't know what's underneath the gap, but he's building a file." Something moved across her face. Not surprise. "Exactly. more the expression of someone seeing a thing confirmed that they had already suspected. I know he doesn't trust. She stopped, restarted more carefully. He manages the family's operational interests. He's done it since my father got ill. And he has a specific way of managing threats to what he sees as his territory. You're not his territory, David said. She looked at him. You're the principal, he's the operator. Those are different things, and men like him spend a lot of effort making sure the principal forgets the difference. She was quiet for a long moment. You learned that from 11 years of protecting other people. I learned it from watching what happens when principals trust the wrong operators. He paused. I'm not telling you this to put him in a worse light. I'm telling you because you deserve to understand the situation fully, and because I'm not going to be in your life, whatever capacity that turns out to be, without you knowing who I am. The phrase whatever capacity that turns out to be moved between them in the October air, like something that had been said for the first time, but been true for longer. Penelope looked at the pond. A family of ducks crossed the far end in single file, unhurried, as if they had done this same crossing every morning for years, and intended to continue doing it indefinitely. My father built the Voss Group from one property in 1971, she said. A warehouse on the east waterfront that everyone told him was worth nothing. He built it into something real. By the time I was old enough to understand what it was already bigger than him, which is both the point and the problem with things you build. She paused. When he got sick, Harlan stepped in. He was the logical choice. He knew the operations. He was family. She pressed her lips together. But he has always treated me as the asset rather than the owner. The name on the building rather than the person who decides what gets built. And you've let him, David said. Not as a judgment, as an observation. She turned to look at him sharply. Then, yes. Why? A long pause. Because it was easier. And because I was spending what energy I had on other things. She looked at her hands in her lap. On specialists. On trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. On sitting on benches in October and not knowing what I was waiting for. The honesty of it, the clean, clear weight of it, landed between them without deflection. Penelope, David said. Her name said plainly without setup. She looked at him. When we met, you said you'd been trying to remember how to want something. He held her gaze. I want you to know that I understand that from the inside, not from observation. I lived it for about a year after Sarah, and it is one of the hardest things I know how to describe. Not grief exactly, but the careful management of hope. The decision to stop wanting things because wanting them costs too much. Yes, she said quietly, and I want you to know that I also know what it looks like when it ends, when the wanting comes back. He paused. I've been watching it happen in you from the first afternoon. She was very still. And I want to be honest about something else, he said, because I've been carrying it, and I think you should know. He looked at her directly, the way he had looked at things in hard places, not with force, but with the complete presence of a man who has decided the truth is more useful than the protection of his own comfort. You told me what the doctor said, 20 of them, the diagnosis. He paused. I don't know what's possible and what isn't. I'm not a doctor and I won't pretend otherwise. What I know is that I've seen things dismissed as impossible that weren't. I know that the distance between what has happened and what can happen is not always as fixed as the people with the most knowledge insist it is. Another pause. And I know that I have thought about you every day since Tuesday. Not about your name or your company or the file someone is building on me. About you, the woman on the bench. Penelope's eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, or not only tears. With something more complicated than that. The look of someone standing at the edge of a door they had locked from the inside and forgotten they held the key to. What are you saying? She asked. Her voice was quiet, direct. She was not a woman who permitted herself to misunderstand things she needed to understand clearly. I'm saying that I would like to know you better, David said, not as a project or a complication or something to manage. As a person, whatever that looks like at whatever pace it needs to go. He paused. And I'm saying that if you decide somewhere in the process of knowing me better, that what you want is something the doctor said was impossible, I would not walk away from that conversation. The silence that followed was the kind that holds something in it. Not emptiness, but fullness. The specific silence of two people in the same moment, both aware of what has been said and what it means. You're offering. She stopped. I'm not offering anything specific, he said carefully. I'm telling you that I'm not going to treat your want as something to manage or minimize. If you want something, I want you to want it fully. He looked at her. And I want you to know that a man who spent 11 years making the impossible possible in dangerous places is not going to look at the word impossible and accept it at face value. She looked at him for a very long time, then she said, There is a doctor. In Zurich. The 21st. She said it with the particular care of someone removing something valuable from a locked drawer. She has a different methodology, a different interpretation of the same data. Every other specialist said it was definitive. She says it might not be. David nodded.